This is what most people think Jesus looked like. Flowing brown hair, blue eyes, fair skin, tall, handsome, European features. This image is in millions of homes, churches, and schools around the world. It's been painted, sculpted, and reproduced for centuries. There's just one problem. This Jesus never existed. The real Jesus, the historical person who walked the dusty roads of first-century Galilee, looked nothing like this. And when forensic scientists, archaeologists, and historians actually reconstruct what Jesus probably looked like based on evidence, the results are shocking. In 2001, a British forensic anthropologist created the first scientific reconstruction of Jesus' face using skull remains from first-century Jewish men found in the region where Jesus lived. When the image was released, it caused controversy around the world. Because the Jesus they reconstructed looked Middle Eastern. He had dark skin, brown eyes, short curly hair, a wide nose. He was probably around 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighed about 110 pounds. He looked like a working-class Palestinian man. In other words, he looked absolutely nothing like the Jesus most Christians have been praying to their entire lives. Today, we're going on a journey through history, art, science, and archaeology to answer one of the most fascinating questions in human history. What did Jesus actually look like? We're going to explore why the image of Jesus changed so dramatically over centuries. We'll look at the forensic evidence. We'll examine how politics, colonialism, and racism shaped Jesus' appearance in art. And we'll ask the uncomfortable question: why does it matter what Jesus looked like? This is going to challenge everything you thought you knew. Some of you will be defensive. Some will be curious. But I promise you, by the end, you'll never look at images of Jesus the same way again. Let's start with what we actually know. What does the Bible say about Jesus' appearance? Here's something that surprises most people. The New Testament tells us almost nothing about what Jesus looked like. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 Gospels that tell Jesus' life story, never describe his physical appearance. Not once. Not his height, his hair color, his eye color, his build. Nothing. That's remarkable, right? These texts tell us what Jesus said, where he went, who he hung out with, what he ate. But they don't tell us what he looked like. The only physical description we have comes from the book of Revelation, which describes a vision of the resurrected Christ. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace. But that's clearly symbolic and apocalyptic, not a physical description of the historical Jesus. It's describing a glorified, heavenly vision, not a man walking around Nazareth. There's one other passage that's sometimes cited. Isaiah 53, written centuries before Jesus, describes a suffering servant. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Early Christians interpreted this as prophecy about Jesus, suggesting he was ordinary-looking, maybe even unattractive, not the Hollywood leading man we see in movies. So the Bible gives us basically nothing to work with. No height, no hair, no distinctive features, which means every image of Jesus throughout history has been a guess, an interpretation, projection. And those projections tell us way more about the people creating them than about Jesus himself. What we know from history and archaeology. If the Bible doesn't tell us what Jesus looked like, can we figure it out from historical and archaeological evidence? Actually, yes, we know quite a bit. Jesus was a first-century Jewish man from Galilee, a region in what's now northern Israel. He was a tekton, usually translated as carpenter, but more accurately, construction worker, or day laborer. He worked with his hands in the Middle Eastern sun. Archaeological evidence from first-century Galilee tells us a lot about what people looked like in that time and place. Average height for men was around 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 5 inches. Nutrition was poor, so people were generally smaller and lighter than modern standards. Jesus probably weighed between 110 to 140 pounds. He would have had Middle Eastern features, olive to dark skin, dark brown or black hair, brown eyes. Hair was typically worn short for working-class men, contrary to artistic depictions. Long hair was actually considered shameful for Jewish men in that culture. His hands would have been calloused and rough from manual labor. His skin would have been weathered and darkened from years working outdoors. He probably had a beard, as was common for Jewish men, but it would have been short and practical, not the long flowing beard in paintings. He would have worn simple, undyed wool clothing, a tunic and possibly a cloak. Colors would have been earth tones: brown, beige, off-white. The bright white robes in paintings? Those were expensive and impractical. Jesus was poor. In other words, if you passed Jesus on the street in first-century Galilee, you wouldn't have noticed him. He would have looked like every other working-class Jewish man in the region. The forensic reconstruction. Meet the scientific Jesus. In 2001, Richard Neve, a retired medical artist from the University of Manchester, led a team to create the first forensic reconstruction of Jesus' face. Here's how they did it. They started with 3 Semite skulls from the same time period and region where Jesus lived. Using forensic anthropology techniques, the same methods used to reconstruct faces in criminal investigations, they built up layers of muscle and tissue based on the bone structure. They analyzed archaeological evidence about typical features of first-century Galilean Jews. They looked at artistic depictions from that era that showed what people actually looked like, rather than idealized religious art. The result was striking. A face that looked distinctly Middle Eastern. Broad features, dark olive skin, deep-set brown eyes, short, curly black hair, a weathered, working-class appearance. When the image was published, it went viral. Major news outlets covered it. Churches debated it. Many Christians were shocked, some even angry, because this Jesus looked nothing like the Jesus they'd grown up with. He didn't look European. He didn't look like the guy in Sunday school pictures. He looked like someone you'd see in Palestine, Egypt, or Syria today. Some critics argued the reconstruction was too speculative, and they're right to some degree. We don't have Jesus' actual skull, so any reconstruction involves educated guessing based on population averages. But here's what's not speculation. Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jewish man. He had Middle Eastern Jewish features. He did not have European features. The forensic Jesus isn't perfect, but it's a hell of a lot closer to reality than blue-eyed Nordic Jesus. So how did we get white Jesus? If Jesus looked Middle Eastern, why do most images show him as white European? That's where the story gets really interesting and uncomfortable. Early Christian art didn't actually depict Jesus much at all. When they did, in the first few centuries, Jesus looked ambiguous, sometimes young and beardless, sometimes older with a beard, but generally with darker features consistent with his Middle Eastern origin. But as Christianity spread into Europe and became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Jesus started looking more Roman, then more European. By the Middle Ages, European artists were painting Jesus to look like them. Italian Jesus looked Italian. German Jesus looked German. English Jesus looked English. This wasn't necessarily malicious at first. Artists painted what they knew. They used local models. They imagined sacred figures in familiar terms. But something changed during the age of colonialism and imperialism. As European powers colonized the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they brought Christianity with them. And they brought their white Jesus. Suddenly, white Jesus wasn't just artistic preference. It became a tool of power and control. Colonizers told indigenous people, "This is what God looks like. He looks like us, not like you. We are made in God's image. You are lesser." White Jesus justified slavery. White Jesus justified genocide. White Jesus justified the civilizing mission of colonialism. If Jesus was white, then white people were closer to God. If Jesus was European, then European culture was God's chosen culture. If Jesus looked like the colonizers, then the colonizers had divine authority. This wasn't subtle. It was explicit. Colonizers literally said these things. Warner Sallman's Head of Christ, painted in 1940, became the most reproduced image of Jesus in history. Hundreds of millions of copies. It shows Jesus with long flowing light brown hair, blue eyes, fair skin, and delicate European features. This image was mass-produced and distributed globally by missionaries and churches. It became the definitive Jesus for much of the world. But Sallman's Jesus isn't historically accurate. It's not even biblically based. It's white American Protestant Jesus, created during an era of American exceptionalism and racial segregation. And here's the thing. This matters. It really matters. Why Jesus' race matters. Some people say, why does it matter what Jesus looked like? His message is what's important, not his appearance. I understand that impulse, but here's why it matters tremendously. First, historical truth matters. If we claim to follow Jesus, we should care about who Jesus actually was, not a fictional version that makes us comfortable. Second, white Jesus has been used to justify horrific oppression. When enslaved Africans were forced to worship a white Jesus who looked like their enslavers, that was psychological violence. When indigenous people were told their brown skin was further from God's image, that was spiritual abuse. Third, white Jesus perpetuates white supremacy, often unconsciously. When the Son of God is depicted as white in a multiracial world, it sends a message about whose humanity is most divine, most valuable, most worthy. Fourth, it affects how people understand Christianity. Many people of color have rejected Christianity specifically because it was presented as a white religion with a white savior. They see white Jesus and think, this isn't for me. And fifth, and this is crucial, depicting Jesus as white contradicts his own message. Jesus identified with the marginalized, the oppressed, the colonized. He was born in occupied territory under Roman rule. He was executed by an empire. Making him look like the colonizers fundamentally betrays what he represented. The Apostle Paul wrote that in Christ there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. The gospel is supposed to transcend racial and ethnic boundaries. But when we make Jesus white, we do the opposite. We make whiteness sacred. How different cultures depict Jesus. Here's what's fascinating. Throughout history, almost every culture has depicted Jesus to look like them. In Ethiopia, Jesus has been portrayed with African features, dark skin, African facial structure, since at least the 4th century. Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity is one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world, and their Jesus has always been black. In China, Jesus has been depicted with East Asian features. In Japan, some Christian art shows Jesus with Japanese characteristics. In Latin America, Jesus often has mestizo features, reflecting the mixed indigenous and Spanish heritage of the region. In Indian Christian art, Jesus sometimes looks Indian, wearing robes similar to traditional Indian clothing. Each culture has made Jesus in their own image, and in one sense that makes sense. People relate to sacred figures who look familiar. But here's the difference. European and American depictions of white Jesus were exported globally as the correct Jesus. They were imposed on colonized peoples. They claimed universality. When Ethiopian Christians paint black Jesus, they're not saying, this is what Jesus definitively looked like. They're saying, Jesus is one of us. God became human in a way we can relate to. When white Christians paint white Jesus and export it worldwide as the standard, they're saying something very different. This is what Jesus actually looked like, and he looks like us, not you. That's the crucial distinction. The biblical Jesus, what did he actually care about? Let's get back to Scripture for a moment, because here's what's ironic. The biblical Jesus was obsessed with challenging appearances and external markers of identity. Jesus constantly criticized people who were focused on external religiosity, the Pharisees who wore fancy religious garments and made public displays of piety. He taught that what matters is the heart, not outward appearance. He spent time with people considered racially and ethnically inferior: Samaritans, Gentiles, tax collectors who collaborated with Rome. He told a story where a Samaritan, a despised ethnic other, was the hero who showed true righteousness. He said the last will be first and the first will be last. He said blessed are the poor, the mourning, the meek, the persecuted. In other words, Jesus' entire message was about overturning social hierarchies, challenging ethnic prejudice, and finding God among the marginalized. So here's the irony. We've taken this Jesus, this brown-skinned, colonized, working-class Jewish man who challenged empire and ethnic supremacy, and we've turned him into the face of white empire and ethnic supremacy. We've made Jesus into the exact thing he opposed. That's not just historically inaccurate, it's theologically backwards. Modern attempts to reclaim Jesus' true appearance. In recent years, there's been a growing movement to reclaim the historical Jesus and challenge white Jesus imagery. Some churches have removed white Jesus paintings and replaced them with more historically accurate depictions. Some Christian artists are creating Jesus images that reflect his actual Middle Eastern heritage. Yeshua. A forensic study was a project that used AI and historical data to create an even more detailed reconstruction of what Jesus likely looked like. Activists have pointed out that if Jesus returned today looking like he actually did, he'd probably be racially profiled at airports, stopped by police, and told to go back where he came from. That's a sobering thought. The Jesus most American Christians worship probably couldn't walk safely through their neighborhoods without being viewed with suspicion. But there's also been significant pushback. Many Christians, especially white evangelicals, have resisted efforts to change Jesus' image. Some claim it's divisive. Some say it's woke politics. Some argue that the image doesn't matter. But resistance to historically accurate depictions of Jesus reveals something. For many people, white Jesus isn't just familiar. It's ideological. It's identity. Challenging white Jesus feels like challenging their understanding of Christianity itself. The real question: who do you say that I am? In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus asks his disciples a question: who do you say that I am? Peter answers, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus commends him for this answer. Notice what Jesus didn't ask, "What do I look like?" He asked, "Who am I?" Identity, not appearance. Character, not complexion. Message, not melanin. And yet, for 2,000 years, Christians have been deeply invested in Jesus' appearance. We've created countless images, each reflecting our own cultures, biases, and power dynamics. The question isn't really whether Jesus was white or brown. Historically, we know he was brown. That's not debatable among scholars. The real question is, why have we been so invested in making him white? And what does it say about us that changing that image feels threatening? If Jesus' appearance doesn't matter, as some claim, then it shouldn't matter if we depict him accurately as Middle Eastern. But for many people, it clearly does matter. The resistance reveals that white Jesus isn't neutral. It's ideological. What should we do? So what do we do with all this? For Christians, I think there are a few important steps. First, acknowledge the truth. Jesus was not white. He was a Middle Eastern Jewish man with Middle Eastern Jewish features. That's history. That's fact. Second, examine your own relationship with images of Jesus. Why do certain depictions feel comfortable or uncomfortable? What does that reveal about your assumptions? Third, consider removing or replacing images of white Jesus, especially in churches and Christian institutions. If we care about historical accuracy and if we believe Jesus came for all people, our imagery should reflect that. Fourth, educate yourself and others about how white Jesus has been used to justify oppression. Understand the history. Teach it. Fifth, remember that Jesus was always on the side of the marginalized. Making him look like the powerful fundamentally betrays his message. And finally, focus on who Jesus was and what he taught, not just what he looked like. The content of his character and teaching should matter more than the color of his skin, but that means we shouldn't whitewash his actual historical identity. For non-Christians watching this, I hope this helps you understand one way that religion intersects with power, race, and colonialism. The image of Jesus has been weaponized throughout history. Knowing that history helps us understand contemporary issues of race and religion. Conclusion: the Jesus we need versus the Jesus we've created. The real Jesus, the historical Jesus, was a brown-skinned, working-class, colonized man who challenged empire, crossed ethnic boundaries, elevated the marginalized, and was ultimately executed by the state. The Jesus we've created in much of Western Christianity is a white, middle-class, empire-blessing figure who looks like the powerful and justifies their power. These are not the same. When we depict Jesus accurately, as he actually was, it changes how we understand his message. A brown Jesus who grew up under Roman occupation speaks differently to people experiencing oppression. A working-class Jesus who did manual labor speaks differently to poor communities. A Jesus who looked like a modern-day Palestinian speaks differently in a world where Palestinians are dehumanized. A Jesus who wouldn't be allowed in certain churches because of how he looks exposes the hypocrisy of those churches. The forensic Jesus, the historical Jesus, is more challenging, more radical, and more relevant than white Jesus ever could be. Because he actually existed, he actually lived, he actually looked like someone we might overlook today. And that's the point. God didn't choose to look like the powerful. God chose to look like the powerless. God entered the world not as a Roman emperor but as a colonized Jewish baby. Not in a palace but in a feeding trough. Not as someone the world would consider beautiful and important, but as someone ordinary and easily dismissed. That's the scandal of the incarnation. That's the radical message of Christianity. But we've spent centuries trying to make Jesus look powerful, important, beautiful by European standards. We've tried to make him look like us instead of recognizing that he looked like them, the people we marginalize. So here's my challenge. Next time you see an image of Jesus, ask yourself, does this look like someone born in occupied territory? Does this look like someone who worked with his hands in the Middle Eastern sun? Does this look like someone who would have been racially profiled and viewed with suspicion? Or does this look like someone designed to make certain people feel comfortable and powerful? The real Jesus makes everyone uncomfortable. He challenged the religious authorities of his day. He challenged ours too. And maybe that's exactly what we need. Thanks for watching. I know this was controversial. I know some of you are uncomfortable. But truth matters. History matters. And if we're going to claim to follow Jesus, we need to be willing to see him as he actually was, not as we wish he'd been. Share this if it challenged you. Comment if you disagree. And remember, the real Jesus is more interesting, more radical, and more relevant than any image we've created. I'll see you in the next video.